Do you know how to walk? I mean, I know that sounds like a stupid question. We all know how to walk. We learned how to do it when we were babies. But if you watch people from other cultures, you'll see they have different gait patterns. And maybe there's one that's a little more natural, a little more optimal. And that's what we'll be exploring in this video, a more natural, optimal way to walk. And at the very end, I'm going to show you a very interesting way of walking up a hill that's going to be almost effortless. So if you're a hiker, you're going to totally love that. And even if you just have to deal with stairs sometimes, you'll find it really interesting there as well. I'm Steven Sashen, co-founder and chief barefoot officer at Xero Shoes. And while we can do this whole exercise in shoes, and I'll talk about shoes in a bit, I'm gonna do it in bare feet just so you can see some more details about things. And I will warn you in advance as I do this, I know that I don't have, photo model feet. I get it. I have Morton's toe. My first toe is shorter than my second toe. I also have slightly flatter feet. FYI, quick tangent, flat feet, high arches, that's not an issue. Arch height, predominantly genetic. Most importantly, arch strength. And when you walk more naturally, you can actually build strength because you'll be using your whole foot in a way that maybe you haven't up until now. There are two principles of natural movement and natural walking, and let's dive into the first one, which is where you place your foot when it lands on the ground. Now, I'm not talking about whether you land on your heel or the ball of your foot or midfoot. That's a whole other thing. We'll get to that, but that's not the important part. It's where your foot is landing in relation to this center of mass. Are you in front of you or underneath you? In front of you is what's referred to as overstriding. So here's a fun story about that. The American writer David Sedaris lives in Paris a lot of the time, maybe actually outside of Paris. He's in France. Anyway, his French friends often accuse him of walking like an American. And one day he asked, what does that mean? And they said, you throw your legs out in front of you. That's another way of describing overstriding. Now, there are 5 problems with overstriding. The first is you're actually using your hip flexor, which is not a super strong muscle, to throw your leg in front of you. So you could be putting extra strain on your hip flexor. The second is you tend to get overweighted when you overstride. And what that means is by the time you're fully placed on this foot, you're kind of committed. So if you step on something unpleasant, there's really not much you can do. You're committed to stepping on that thing, and that can be really painful. When instead you're landing with your foot underneath you, you have a better ability to use a reflex arc to get off of that unpleasant thing. Third problem is that when you overstride, you're basically putting the brakes on with every step. So you have force coming back up this way. Now this is important especially when you're on some slippery surface, because when you're putting force that way, that means you're sending force this way, and it makes things slippery. Interestingly, if you step on ice and you just put your foot up and down over and over and over, never a problem. In fact, there are runners who at full speed, they can run across ice without a problem, because when you're running at full speed, you're pretty much landing with your foot underneath your center of mass. The next problem with overstriding is that when you actually are putting the brakes on, you're also sending a spike of force through your joints that's going into your ankle, your knee, your hip, your back, and whichever is the weakest link in that chain, that's going to suffer the consequences. And last but not least, when you overstride, you're landing on your heel. Now, I'm going to get into this whole thing about whether you're supposed to land on your heel or not. People say we have a fat pad on our heel, so we're meant to walk and land heel first. And I'm not going to disagree with that, but there's 2 ways you can land on your heel. If you're overstriding, you're landing on the back part of your heel, and I'll demonstrate this in a second, rather than underneath your heel, which is where the fat pad actually is. So this is putting pressure right on your heel bone, which can cause problems, versus when you're doing this, you're landing really on that fat pad, using it properly. So one way of experimenting with this is just feel the difference of taking tiny little steps where you can feel that you're actually using that fat pad versus reaching way out in front of you. Exaggerate it for the fun of it, and you'll see, you'll actually even hear the force that you're putting on the ground by going right into that heel bone. So that's that 5th principle about a problem with overstriding, is what you're doing by not using the heel pad correctly. So if we're going to talk about landing with your foot underneath your center of mass, the magic question is, how do you do that? And there are, let's say, 3 hacks for doing this, and then the technique that I'll teach you for natural walking. Hack number 1, get out of a shoe that has an elevated heel. Because if you have an elevated heel, that means you have to lean back. Well, when you have an elevated heel, it makes you tip forward a little bit, and you need to lean back a little bit just to stay vertical. So when you're leaning back, the problem is it's almost impossible to do anything other than throw your foot in front of you, because you can't use the muscles that would drive your heel back to move you forward. By the way, that's a hint about the technique. So when you're leaning back even a tiny bit, you have to overuse that hip flexor to throw your foot in front of you. So get out of a elevated heel shoe and onto something flat, and you'll find that maybe you're already walking a little differently. You might also feel like you're leaning forward when you're actually standing up straight, so you might want to have someone videotape you to see what you're really doing that's different than what you think you're doing, which actually leads to the next way of kind of hacking landing with your foot in front of you, or sorry, landing with your foot underneath you, and that is lean forward just a tiny bit. Lean from the ankles a tiny bit. You'll feel like you're about to fall forward a little bit because you are, but you want to use that to your advantage. In other words, if you lean forward and you don't throw your leg out in front of you, you're going to be landing with your foot more underneath you. And you'll feel like you're kind of using that falling forward as a way of moving forward, which is a great idea, a great hack. The third hack is what I'm doing: go barefoot and find a surface like the one I'm on, a bike path, a trail, a road, a driveway, something with a little texture, something that may even be a tiny, tiny bit unpleasant, and walk barefoot. What you want to do is experiment, because basically if you're walking barefoot, or running barefoot, same thing, doing it correctly feels great. Doing it incorrectly does not. So experiment and see, if you're this kind of person, an experimental person, see what you can do to change your gait so that it feels good, even on a slightly unpleasant surface. Okay, those are the 3 hacks. Now let's talk about the technique. And this is going to sound a little weird, but it's kind of based on what you would do if you were ice skating or roller skating. In other words, you're going to be thinking about using two of the biggest muscles in your body, your glutes and your hamstrings, to move you forward because they're pushing back. So this is called hip extension, and you're using your glutes and hamstrings really, really well. And if you think about an ice skater or a roller skater, that's how they skate. The front foot is underneath their center of mass, and then they're pushing back to move forward. So this is going to be similar to that. Here are the instructions. By the way, this is going to seem weird. It's going to seem a little difficult for some people. Don't worry, it takes a very short amount of time till you get it. Step number 1, lift, let's say, we'll use your left foot. Lift your left foot an inch off the ground. So your toes are literally just an inch off the ground. What you're going to do with your back leg, and I'll do this facing in both directions so you can see it, is you're going to think about driving that heel backwards to push you forward. While you do this, don't do anything with this leg. You've already flexed this hip a tiny bit. That's all you need to do. The only thing you're going to do with this leg is catch you so you don't fall on your face. It'll look like this. Notice where my foot is in relation to my center of mass, right underneath it. Notice something else too. I'll do it again. My knee is a little bent. I'm actually using the muscles, ligaments, and tendons of my ankle, my knee, and my hip, which when you use them are joint protectors. And when you use them, they can get stronger because, use it or lose it. There's even research showing that just walking in a minimalist shoe, which can encourage that natural movement, builds foot strength as much as doing an actual foot exercise program. So again, from this side, lifting up the left foot a tiny bit, driving this heel back, and just using that front leg to catch you so you don't fall forward. Okay, now I'll show it in the other direction, same idea. Left leg up, so my toe is an inch off the ground. I'm using my glutes and hamstrings to push me forward. Now, if you're not sure if you're using your glutes, one way of doing it, put your hand on your butt and see when you're moving if you can feel it flexing. If not, kind of work and see if you can find a way to flex it first and then move forward. So the second part of this is really easy: lather, rinse, and repeat. Now, I will tell you in advance, you're going to look like a dork when you first try this because it'll be robotic. So for example, first step, now this leg is already back. You don't want to swing it forward. You just want to relax it as much as possible and do the same thing. So again, I'll do this from both sides. And it really will look that robotic for a while. So for example, I'll take 3 or 4 steps, lifting up my right foot this time, push, land, push, land, push, land, push, land. If I start to smooth it out a little bit, it'll look less dorky, but still a little. But if I really smooth it out, it's going to look effortless. Now, admittedly, you're taking shorter steps. That's partly just for this video because we have just a limited amount of space we can use. But when you're not reaching way out in front of you, and instead you're landing with your foot underneath you and pushing back to move forward, you will be taking shorter steps, but you'll also be enjoying it much, much more. So the idea is practice this, feel robotic at first, and then just start smoothing it out. And you'll also notice that you're not bouncing quite so much when you walk. Everything just seems like it's on a more even plane, and you're going to be using your body differently. Now, by the way, I'm not saying you have to do this all the time. This is something that if you're taking a walk, experiment with it. You'll see as you play with it more, it'll become more natural for you and more easy for you. But there's certain times, certain situations where you're gonna have to reach forward to walk, where you're gonna have to land on a different part of your foot than just rolling on your heel. In fact, you can land, like I said before, you can land on your heel, on the bottom of your heel, you can land midfoot, you can land on the ball of your foot. What you don't want to do is reach way out no matter what, especially then, and land on the ball of your foot. Aside from the fact that it looks like you're sort of prancing, it's also just putting extra strain on your metatarsals, especially if you're walking faster, or especially if you're running. Don't reach out and point your toes. It's that simple. I know it sounds crazy, but it's really that simple. Use your glutes, use your hamstrings to extend behind you, which pushes you forward. Relax that front leg as much as possible. Okay, now I'm going to show you how to walk uphill effortlessly. Okay, wait, before we go uphill, I want to talk about going downhill really quick. Same basic idea. You want to land with your foot underneath your center of mass. That way you're less slippery if you're on something that's a slippery surface. And the way you have to do that, not surprisingly, is by using your legs. So rather than just catapulting yourself downhill and catching yourself on your foot, that's really jarring when I do that. You want to think about bending your leg and letting your foot come underneath you. Now, I'll tell you that when I do this, sometimes I roll over my heel, sometimes I land on the ball of my foot first, sometimes on my heel, sometimes ball of my foot first. It doesn't matter. It changes. That'll be up to you. Okay, so that's a quick thing about going downhill. And by the way, it is harder to go downhill than uphill because you're using your quads eccentrically. You're making them work while they're stretching, and that's always harder. That's why you might get tired walking uphill, but you get really sore from walking downhill. Okay, let's go uphill. So here in Colorado where I live, there are a lot of hills, and I figured this out a couple months ago. I don't know how. It's going to look dorky. I'm going to tell you right up front, but it's going to be really cool. I encourage you to try it. So the first step for going uphill is you want to twist your body away from the foot that's on the ground. So my right foot's on the ground, I'm twisting my body to the left. That's stretching this hip flexor. When I put this foot on the ground, underneath my center of mass, I'm going to twist back the other way. When I do that, it basically lets me release this spring that I've created with my hip flexor. And if I don't try to throw my leg in front of me, by just releasing it, it lands practically right underneath my center of mass. I've twisted the other way. If I twist back, it's the same thing. I've got this hip flexor stretched. Now it releases, this foot lands underneath me. Again, I know this looks dorky. Let me show it to you, show you what it looks like if I do it for real. You don't have to do this with your arms. I don't know why I am. And again, no, it looks a little crazy, but if you try it, you're going to find that it takes way less effort than throwing your leg out in front of you, pushing to get uphill. And you're also using your glutes and hamstrings a little more, which can make them stronger. So as you experiment with natural or optimal walking, I really want to hear what you experience. Throw that in the comments below. And also a quick public service announcement. Well, and that is, one of the things that can really help with all of this is, again, getting out of a shoe that elevates your heel, getting into a shoe that lets your toes spread so they're not getting squeezed together, having something flexible enough so your feet can actually bend and move the way they're supposed to, which again can help them get stronger, and give you that ground feeling that you're looking for so your brain knows how to help you move effectively and efficiently because it's feeling the ground, but also giving you that traction and protection that you would want. So I'm showing this with a shoe that I developed called the Speed Force. This is the most barefoot shoe that we make at Xero Shoes, but we also have hiking shoes and boots. We have casual shoes and boots. We have pretty much a boot or a shoe or a sandal for everything you would want to use. So check out xeroshoes.com, find out what happens when you slip into a pair and go out, have fun walking or running or hiking or doing anything you can think of, and live life feet first.